Am I just overreacting, or is my boyfriend boss hitting on me? When Richard complimented my presentation style while letting his hand linger on my shoulder, I felt that familiar flutter of unease. But maybe successful women just have to get used to navigating these gray areas. Emma Martinez had always been good at reading people. It was what made her successful in marketing, what helped her navigate the complex dynamics of Morrison and Associates, and what initially drew her to Jake 3 years ago when she could tell he was genuinely interested in her thoughts, not just her appearance. At 28, she'd built a reputation as someone who could decode client motivations, anticipate market responses, and generally trust her instincts about human behavior, which was why the current situation felt so disorienting. "You're overthinking it," Jake said, not looking up from his laptop as Emma described her latest interaction with Richard Morrison, the founding partner of the firm where Jake worked as a senior analyst. "He's just being supportive of your career. You know how much he values talent." Emma stirred her coffee, watching the cream swirl into abstract patterns. They were sitting in their usual Sunday morning spot, the breakfast nook of their shared apartment, Jake catching up on work while she tried to process the subtle shift she'd been noticing in Richard's behavior over the past month. "I know, but there's something about the way he..." "Emma." Jake's voice carried that patient tone she'd been hearing more often lately. "Richard Morrison is a respected partner at one of the city's top consulting firms. He's been nothing but professional and supportive since you started working on the Henderson project. Maybe you're just not used to having someone in his position take such an active interest in your work." She wanted to argue, to explain that it wasn't about Richard's position or her lack of experience with high-level mentorship. It was about the way his eyes lingered when he complimented her strategic thinking, the way he found reasons to stay late when she was working on the project, the way he asked about her background, her goals, her relationship with Jake, always framed as professional interest, but feeling like something more. But how do you explain intuition to someone who deals in data and analysis? "You're probably right," she said, because it was easier than trying to articulate something she couldn't quite define herself. The Henderson project had been a breakthrough opportunity, a chance to prove herself on a major client account that typically went to more senior associates. When Richard personally requested her for the team, Jake had been thrilled. It was exactly the kind of recognition that could accelerate her career trajectory, and working closely with the founding partner would give her invaluable exposure to high-level strategy. Emma had been excited too initially. Richard Morrison was legendary in their industry, a strategic mind who'd built his firm from nothing into a powerhouse that attracted Fortune 500 clients. Tall, silver-haired, with the kind of authoritative presence that commanded respect in boardrooms, he was exactly the kind of mentor she'd hoped to work with someday. The first few weeks had been everything she'd expected. Richard was demanding but fair, pushing her to think more strategically while providing the kind of guidance that was clearly accelerating her professional development. He praised her insights during client meetings, trusted her with increasingly complex analysis, and made sure she received credit for her contributions. It was subtle at first, so subtle she dismissed it as her own imagination. The way he'd pause when she entered a room, as if taking her in. The compliments that seemed to focus as much on her presence as her work. "You have a way of commanding attention when you present, Emma. It's quite striking." The casual touches during meetings, a hand on her shoulder when he leaned over to look at her laptop, fingers brushing hers when passing documents. Each incident alone was easily explained away. Richard was from a generation where such gestures were more common professional courtesy. He was probably just being fatherly, or treating her the way he would any promising junior associate. The problem was, Emma had observed Richard with other junior associates, including male colleagues, and the dynamic felt different. "Maybe I'm just being paranoid," she told her reflection in the bathroom mirror Monday morning, applying lipstick with more care than usual. She'd been second-guessing her appearance choices lately, wondering if her professional wardrobe was somehow sending the wrong message. The navy blazer and pencil skirt that had always felt appropriately professional now seemed to highlight her figure in a way that made her self-conscious. The morning client meeting proceeded normally. Richard was his usual sharp, strategic self, leading the discussion with the kind of commanding presence that made clients trust his judgment implicitly. Emma presented her market analysis findings, fielding questions with the confidence she developed over months of working on the account. "Excellent work, as always," Richard said as the clients filed out of the conference room. "Your insights on the demographic shift were particularly astute. You have a gift for seeing patterns others miss." "Thank you," Emma replied, beginning to pack up her materials. "I think the data really supports a pivot in their messaging strategy." "Absolutely. Which is why I think you should take the lead on the next phase of the campaign." He moved closer, ostensibly to help her collect the scattered presentation slides. "You've earned it." His hand brushed hers as he passed her a document, and this time the contact seemed deliberate. Not aggressive, not inappropriate enough to call out, but intentional in a way that made her pulse quicken uncomfortably. "I really appreciate the opportunity," she said, stepping back slightly. "I see great potential in you, Emma." His voice dropped slightly, taking on a more personal tone. "You remind me of myself at your age, ambitious, intuitive, willing to go the extra mile for success." The compliment should have felt professional, but something about his tone, the way he held her gaze, made it feel loaded with subtext. Or was she reading too much into it? The uncertainty was becoming familiar, this constant second-guessing of her own perceptions. "I should get back to my desk," she said, gathering her things more quickly. "Of course. But Emma," he paused at the door, "I hope you know that my door is always open. For career guidance, strategic discussions, or just to talk. Sometimes the path to success requires navigating complex dynamics." That phrase stuck with her for the rest of the day. Complex dynamics. What did that mean? Was he offering genuine mentorship, or was there an implication she was missing? The ambiguity was maddening, leaving her unable to focus on her work as she replayed the interaction, searching for hidden meanings in every word and gesture. By evening, she'd convinced herself she was overreacting. Richard Morrison was a successful, respected professional. He was Jake's boss, for heaven's sake. The idea that he might be crossing boundaries was probably just her own insecurity projecting meaning onto innocent interactions. But as she prepared for bed that night, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in their dynamic. The question was whether that shift was real, or just in her increasingly paranoid mind. What would you do if you noticed something that felt wrong but couldn't prove it? Share your thoughts below. The Henderson client dinner was supposed to be a celebration. 3 months of intensive work had culminated in a successful campaign launch, with preliminary metrics showing exactly the kind of results that would cement Emma's reputation and potentially fast-track her promotion. Richard had insisted on taking the core team out to Meridian, the kind of upscale restaurant where deals were made and careers were launched. Emma had chosen her outfit carefully. A black wrap dress that was elegant but conservative, professional but not severe. She'd learned to navigate the impossible balance of looking competent without appearing to try too hard, attractive without seeming to leverage her appearance. Tonight felt important, a chance to solidify her position on Richard's team and prove she belonged in these high-stakes environments. The dinner started exactly as expected. Richard held court at the head of the table, regaling the clients with industry insights and strategic anecdotes that reinforced his reputation as a visionary leader. Emma contributed thoughtfully to the conversation, her market analysis providing the foundation for several strategic discussions that clearly impressed the Henderson executives. Emma's research was the cornerstone of this entire campaign, Richard told the clients, raising his wine glass. "We're fortunate to have someone with her analytical skills and strategic intuition on our team." The praise felt genuine, professional, exactly the kind of recognition Emma had hoped for. She allowed herself to relax slightly, enjoying the satisfaction of a job well done and the prospect of future opportunities. It was only as the evening progressed that the atmosphere began to shift in ways that felt increasingly uncomfortable. Richard's attention seemed to focus more intently on Emma as the wine flowed and the conversation became more personal. He asked about her background, her goals, her thoughts on industry trends. Questions that could be interpreted as professional interest but felt increasingly probing. "You have excellent instincts," he said during a lull in the conversation, his voice carrying across the table despite the ambient restaurant noise. "It's rare to find someone who can balance analytical rigor with creative intuition the way you do." Emma smiled politely, but noticed the way his gaze lingered on her face, then dropped briefly to her neckline before returning to her eyes. The gesture was so quick she might have imagined it, but it left her feeling exposed in a way that had nothing to do with her dress's modest cut. "Thank you," she replied, hoping her voice sounded more confident than she felt. "I think the key is really understanding the human psychology behind the data." "Exactly." Richard leaned forward slightly, his attention now completely focused on her despite the other people at the table. "You understand that business is fundamentally about human connection, about reading what people really want versus what they say they want." Something about his tone made the comment feel like it had multiple layers of meaning. Emma glanced around the table, but the clients were engaged in their own side conversation, and her colleagues seemed oblivious to the undercurrent she was detecting. As the evening continued, Richard's behavior became increasingly difficult to interpret. He made sure her wine glass was never empty, insisted she try items from his plate when she mentioned they looked interesting, and gradually shifted the conversation to include more personal topics. "Emma was telling me earlier about her photography hobby," he said to the table, though Emma couldn't recall mentioning photography to him recently. "She has an artist's eye for capturing moments that others might miss." The comment wasn't inappropriate, but something about the way he said it, the emphasis on capturing moments, made Emma's skin crawl. She forced a smile and redirected the conversation back to business topics, but Richard seemed determined to maintain a more personal dynamic. The real incident happened as they were preparing to leave. The clients had departed, and the team was gathering their things when Richard approached Emma near the coat check. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" he asked, his hand lightly touching her elbow to guide her toward a quieter corner of the restaurant's entrance area. Emma's colleagues were still settling the bill and collecting their coats, so she followed Richard to the alcove near the restaurant's entrance, assuming he wanted to discuss some aspect of the evening's business conversations. "I wanted to thank you personally for your exceptional work on this project," Richard said, standing closer than necessary in the intimate space. "Your contributions have been invaluable, and I want you to know that I've been very impressed with your capabilities." Again, that slight pause before a word that could be interpreted multiple ways. Emma felt her pulse quicken as she became hyper-aware of their proximity. The way Richard's body language seemed to create a private bubble around them despite the public setting. "I really appreciate the opportunity," she replied, taking a small step back, but the alcove didn't provide much room for maneuvering. "I think you have tremendous potential," Richard continued, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone. "The kind of potential that could take you very far in this industry, with the right guidance and support." His hand moved to her shoulder, ostensibly a gesture of mentorship, but the contact felt charged with something more than professional encouragement. Emma found herself frozen, uncertain whether to step away and risk seeming rude, or to tolerate the contact and risk encouraging whatever dynamic was developing. "I hope you'll consider allowing me to take a more active role in your career development," Richard said, his thumb moving almost imperceptibly against her shoulder. "I see great things ahead for you, Emma. Great things." The words themselves were perfectly professional, the kind of thing any mentor might say to a promising junior colleague. But the delivery, the intimate tone, the meaningful eye contact, the subtle physical contact, transformed the interaction into something that felt inappropriate without being explicitly so. Emma's mind raced as she tried to process what was happening. Was Richard making a move on her, or was she misinterpreting enthusiastic mentorship? The ambiguity was maddening, leaving her unable to respond appropriately because she couldn't definitively categorize the interaction. "Richard, there you are. Jake's voice cut through the moment as he approached with their coats. Ready to head out? Richard's hand dropped from Emma's shoulder smoothly, his demeanor shifting back to professional friendliness without missing a beat. Of course. Just telling Emma how impressed I am with her work. You're a lucky man, Jake, to have someone so talented in your life. The comment was perfectly appropriate, even complimentary toward their relationship, but something about the way Richard said it felt like a subtle challenge, as if he was testing boundaries or establishing some kind of territorial awareness. Jake beamed with pride. I keep telling her she's going to run circles around all of us eventually. I wouldn't be surprised, Richard replied, his smile warm and fatherly. She certainly has all the right qualities for success. As they walked to their cars, Emma found herself analyzing every aspect of the interaction. Had Richard been inappropriate, or had she misread the situation entirely? The physical contact could have been innocent mentorship. The intimate tone could have been the result of wine and a successful evening. The meaningful looks could have been her imagination, influenced by her own growing paranoia about their professional relationship. But as she replayed the moment in her mind, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that Richard had been testing her boundaries, seeing how she would respond to increasingly personal behavior. The question was whether this was the calculated move of someone with inappropriate intentions, or the misguided enthusiasm of a mentor who didn't realize how his behavior might be perceived. Great evening, Jake said as they drove home. Richard really seems to value your work. That kind of recognition from a partner is huge for your career. Yeah, Emma replied, staring out the window at the passing streetlights. It was interesting. Interesting how? Emma hesitated, unsure how to articulate her concerns without sounding paranoid or ungrateful. I don't know. Some of his comments felt a little personal. Personal how? Maybe I'm overthinking it, she said, already retreating from the conversation. How could she explain that Richard's praise felt loaded with subtext without sounding like she was imagining things? You probably are, Jake said gently. Richard's from a different generation. He's probably just not used to working with women at your level. He might be trying to be encouraging and not realizing how it comes across. The explanation made sense, and Emma wanted to believe it. But as she lay in bed that night, she couldn't stop thinking about the moment in the alcove, the way Richard's presence had felt invasive despite the public setting, the way his touch had lingered just long enough to feel deliberate. The worst part was the uncertainty. If Richard had been clearly inappropriate, she would have known how to respond. If he had been obviously professional, she could have dismissed her concerns. But the ambiguity left her in a psychological limbo, unable to trust her own perceptions or know how to proceed. Was she being paranoid, or was she ignoring red flags? The question would haunt her for weeks to come, as she began to realize that this incident had shifted something fundamental in her relationship with Richard Morrison, and possibly with her own sense of reality. Are you team trust your instincts or team you're overthinking it? Let us know in the comments. The coffee shop near Emma's office had become her unofficial therapy session location, though she'd never admitted that to herself. It was where she met Sarah Chun, her former colleague from a previous job, every few weeks to decompress and gain perspective on the increasingly complex dynamics at Morrison and Associates. So let me get this straight, Sarah said, stirring her latte with the kind of precision that reflected her analytical nature. Your boyfriend's boss, who happens to be the founding partner of the firm, is giving you career-making opportunities and mentorship, and you're worried because he complimented your work and touched your shoulder? When Sarah put it that way, Emma felt ridiculous. The restaurant incident from 2 weeks ago had been replaying in her mind constantly, but hearing it summarized so clinically made her concerns sound paranoid and ungrateful. It's not just that, Emma said, though she struggled to articulate what exactly it was. There's something about the way he looks at me, the way he talks to me. It feels different from how he interacts with other people. Different how? Emma stared into her coffee, searching for words to describe something that existed more in tone and implication than in concrete actions. More personal. Like he's interested in me as a person, not just as an employee. And that's necessarily bad because I'm with Jake. Because he's Jake's boss. Because there's a power dynamic that makes the whole thing inappropriate. Emma's voice rose slightly, drawing glances from nearby tables. She lowered it and continued. Because when your boss starts treating you differently than other employees, it usually means something. Sarah nodded slowly, but Emma could see the skepticism in her expression. Have you talked to Jake about this? Sort of. He thinks I'm overthinking it. Maybe you are. The casual dismissal stung more than Emma expected. Sarah had always been her sounding board for workplace politics, the friend who helped her navigate complex professional relationships. If even Sarah thought she was being paranoid, maybe she really was losing perspective. Look, Sarah continued, I know you're good at reading people. But sometimes when we're in high-pressure situations, we can misinterpret attention as something more significant than it actually is. Maybe Richard Morrison is just one of those old-school mentors who takes a personal interest in promising employees. Emma wanted to believe that explanation, but it didn't account for the way Richard's behavior made her feel. Hyper-aware of her appearance, constantly second-guessing her own reactions, increasingly uncomfortable in situations that should have felt professionally rewarding. The doubt had been growing since the restaurant incident, coloring every interaction with Richard in shades of uncertainty. Yesterday's team meeting had been particularly unsettling, though Emma couldn't pinpoint exactly why. Richard had been his usual strategic self, leading the discussion about upcoming client presentations with the kind of focused intensity that made everyone perform at their highest level. But Emma had noticed the way his eyes seemed to find her more frequently than others, the way he asked for her input on questions that other team members were equally qualified to answer. Emma, what's your take on the demographic analysis for the Peterson account? He'd asked, even though David, who'd compiled the analysis, was sitting right there. I think David's research shows a clear opportunity in the 35 to 54 age bracket, she'd replied, trying to redirect credit appropriately. Yes, but what do you think about the implications for our messaging strategy? Richard had pressed, his attention focused entirely on her despite the fact that messaging strategy was technically outside her primary responsibilities. The exchange had been perfectly professional, but Emma had felt the weight of his attention in a way that made her self-conscious about her responses, her posture, her appearance. When she'd suggested a particular strategic approach, Richard had smiled in a way that felt approving of more than just her professional insights. That's exactly the kind of innovative thinking I value, he'd said, and something about his tone had made the compliment feel personal rather than professional. Later that afternoon, Emma had been working late on the Peterson analysis when Richard stopped by her desk, something he'd been doing with increasing frequency over the past few weeks. How's the research coming along? He'd asked, leaning against her desk in a way that put him closer to her workspace than necessary. Good. I think I've identified some interesting patterns in the consumer behavior data, Emma had replied, trying to focus on her computer screen rather than Richard's proximity. I'm sure you have. You have a gift for seeing connections others miss. He'd paused, and Emma had felt his attention like a physical weight. Are you planning to work much later? Probably another hour or so. I'll be here late as well, working on the Henderson follow-up strategy. If you need anything, or if you want to discuss your findings. He'd let the sentence hang, creating an invitation that felt loaded with possibility. Emma had mumbled something about getting back to work, and Richard had eventually moved on, but the interaction had left her feeling unsettled. Was he being supportive, or was he testing her availability? The uncertainty was exhausting, making her question every professional interaction. Now, sitting across from Sarah, Emma tried to explain the cumulative effect of these ambiguous encounters. It's like he's always testing boundaries, she said. Never crossing any clear lines, but always pushing just a little further into personal territory. Or maybe he's just trying to build a mentoring relationship and doesn't realize how it's coming across, Sarah countered. Men his age aren't always great at navigating professional relationships with younger women. He might be trying to be fatherly and not realizing the impact. The explanation was reasonable, and Emma wanted to accept it. But something in her gut resisted the easy interpretation. She'd worked with older male mentors before, and none of them had made her feel this constant sense of being evaluated, of being seen as more than just a professional colleague. "Maybe you're right," Emma said, though the words felt hollow. "Maybe I'm just not used to having someone at his level pay attention to my work." "That's probably it," Sarah agreed. "You're talented, Emma. It makes sense that partners would notice. Don't let imposter syndrome convince you that professional recognition must have ulterior motives." The conversation should have been reassuring, but as Emma walked back to her office, she felt more confused than ever. Was she suffering from imposter syndrome, or was she ignoring legitimate concerns about Richard's behavior? The uncertainty was becoming a constant companion, making her second-guess not just Richard's actions, but her own perceptions. That evening, Emma tried to discuss her concerns with Jake again, hoping for validation or at least a more nuanced perspective than Sarah had provided. "I think Richard might be, I don't know, too interested in me," she said as they prepared dinner together. Jake looked up from chopping vegetables, his expression already showing the patient tolerance that had become his default response to her concerns about Richard. "Too interested how?" "He asks personal questions. He finds excuses to work late when I'm working late. He compliments me in ways that feel different from how he talks to other people." "Different how?" Emma felt the familiar frustration of trying to explain something that existed in nuance rather than concrete actions. "More personal. Like he's flirting, but in a way that maintains plausible deniability." Jake set down his knife and turned to face her fully. "Emma, do you hear yourself? You're describing a respected professional who's been nothing but supportive of your career, and you're turning it into some kind of harassment scenario." "I'm not saying it's harassment. I'm saying it feels inappropriate." "Based on what? Compliments? Professional attention? Questions about your background?" Jake's voice carried a note of exasperation that Emma had been hearing more frequently. "Richard Morrison didn't build a successful firm by alienating talented employees. He's investing in your career because he sees your potential. But what if it's more than that? Then you're going to torpedo an incredible opportunity because you're paranoid about your own success." The word paranoid hit Emma like a physical blow. Was that really how Jake saw her concerns? As paranoia rather than legitimate intuition about a complex situation? "I'm not paranoid," she said quietly. "I'm trying to navigate a complicated dynamic with someone who has enormous power over both our careers. And you're doing it by assuming the worst about his motivations instead of appreciating the opportunity you've been given." The conversation ended there, with Emma feeling more isolated than ever. If Jake thought she was paranoid, and Sarah thought she was overthinking, maybe she really was losing perspective. Maybe the stress of working at a higher level was making her misinterpret normal professional interactions. But as she lay in bed that night, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with her situation. The doubt had taken root, growing stronger with each ambiguous interaction, each dismissive response from the people she trusted most. The question was no longer whether Richard's behavior was inappropriate. It was whether she could trust her own perceptions enough to act on her concerns, or whether she was becoming the paranoid woman that everyone seemed to think she was. The uncertainty was becoming its own form of psychological torture, leaving Emma trapped between her instincts and the rational explanations that everyone else seemed to accept so easily. Emma found herself doing something she'd never done before in her professional life: systematically documenting interactions with her boss. The small notebook she'd started carrying wasn't for meeting notes or project planning. It was for tracking the subtle patterns of Richard Morrison's behavior that everyone else seemed to dismiss as normal mentorship. March 15 to 3:47 p.m. Asked about weekend plans during Henderson debrief. Said I seemed refreshed on Monday. Wanted to know what I'd done to recharge. Lingered at my desk for 5 minutes after work discussion ended. March 17 to 11:20 a.m. Complimented my natural grace. during client presentation. Said I had presence that commands attention. David gave better analysis, but Richard barely acknowledged him. March 19 to 6:15 p.m. Stayed late working on Peterson materials. Richard came by twice to check progress. Second time brought coffee, asked if I was taking care of myself. Touched my shoulder when leaving. Reading back through her entries, Emma felt simultaneously vindicated and ridiculous. The individual incidents still seemed innocuous when written down, but the pattern was undeniable. Richard's attention toward her had intensified significantly over the past month, and it was consistently more personal than his interactions with other team members. She'd started paying closer attention to how Richard behaved with her male colleagues, and the contrast was stark. With David, Marcus, and the other associates, Richard was direct, strategic, focused purely on work deliverables. He praised their analysis, critiqued their approach, and moved on. With Emma, conversations always seemed to drift toward personal territory. Compliments always seemed to include some reference to her appearance or presence, and his physical proximity always felt deliberate rather than coincidental. The problem was that none of it was concrete enough to constitute evidence of anything inappropriate. Richard hadn't made explicit advances, hadn't said anything that couldn't be interpreted as professional interest, hadn't touched her in ways that were clearly sexual. Everything existed in the gray area between mentorship and something more problematic. Emma had started researching workplace harassment policies, trying to understand what constituted inappropriate behavior versus normal professional interaction. The guidelines were frustratingly vague when it came to situations like hers. Emotional harassment, subtle boundary violations, the kind of behavior that created uncomfortable dynamics without crossing clear legal lines. She'd also begun observing Richard's behavior more systematically, looking for patterns that might help her understand his motivations. During team meetings, she noticed how his eyes tracked her movements, how he asked for her input disproportionately often, how his body language seemed more animated when she was speaking. But were these signs of inappropriate interest, or was she projecting meaning onto normal interactions? The investigation had become consuming, affecting her ability to focus on actual work. Emma found herself analyzing every gesture, every word choice, every pause in conversation for hidden meaning. She'd started arriving at the office earlier and staying later, partly to avoid one-on-one interactions with Richard, partly to observe his behavior patterns when he thought he wasn't being watched. What she discovered was troubling, though still maddeningly ambiguous. Richard did seem to treat her differently than other employees. He remembered personal details about her life that he didn't retain about others. He asked about her career goals with an intensity that felt more personal than professional. He found excuses to include her in meetings and projects that weren't directly related to her expertise. But he also continued to be an exceptional mentor. The opportunities he provided were genuine, the feedback was valuable, and the professional development was accelerating her career in ways that would have been impossible without his support. Emma found herself trapped between gratitude for his mentorship and growing unease about his apparent personal interest. The most disturbing discovery came during a late evening at the office. Emma had been working on quarterly reports when she noticed Richard's office light was still on, unusual for 8 p.m. on a Thursday. She'd walked past his door on her way to the printer and glanced inside, seeing him reviewing what appeared to be personnel files. Her personnel file was on top of the stack. Emma had frozen in the doorway, watching as Richard studied her professional headshot, her resume, her performance evaluations. There was something about his focus, the way he lingered on her photograph, that felt voyeuristic rather than professional. When he'd looked up and noticed her watching, his expression had shifted quickly to businesslike casualness. "Just reviewing the quarterly evaluations," he'd said, closing her file smoothly. "Your performance metrics are quite impressive." "Thank you," Emma had replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I should get back to the reports." "Of course. Don't work too late, Emma. It's important to maintain balance." The interaction had been perfectly professional, But Emma couldn't shake the image of Richard studying her photograph with what had looked like personal rather than professional interest. Was she imagining the intensity she'd witnessed, or had she caught him in a moment of inappropriate behavior? She'd started paying attention to Richard's computer screen when she passed his office, looking for any signs that he might be researching her background or social media profiles. She'd begun varying her work schedule, leaving at different times to see if Richard's departure patterns changed in response. She'd even started documenting which projects Richard assigned to her versus other team members, looking for evidence that he was creating opportunities for increased interaction. The investigation was becoming obsessive, but Emma felt she had no choice. Everyone else dismissed her concerns, so she had to gather evidence that would either validate her instincts or prove that she was indeed being paranoid. The problem was that the evidence remained stubbornly ambiguous, supporting multiple interpretations depending on how you chose to view Richard's motivations. Her relationship with Jake was deteriorating under the strain of her growing preoccupation with Richard's behavior. Every conversation about work seemed to circle back to her concerns about his boss, and Jake's patience was wearing thin. "You're obsessing about this," he said one evening as Emma described her latest analysis of Richard's meeting patterns. "You're documenting interactions like you're building a legal case, when you should be focusing on the incredible opportunities you're being given." "I'm trying to understand what's happening," Emma replied. "Something feels wrong about this whole situation." "What feels wrong is that you're turning professional recognition into some kind of conspiracy theory," Jake shot back. "Richard Morrison is a respected partner who's invested in your career. Instead of being grateful, you're treating him like a predator." The accusation stung because Emma wasn't sure it was entirely wrong. Was she being unfair to Richard, interpreting innocent mentorship through the lens of her own insecurities? Or was she picking up on subtle cues that everyone else was missing? Her investigation had also revealed uncomfortable truths about her own behavior. She'd started dressing more conservatively, avoiding certain colors and styles that might be interpreted as attention-seeking. She'd begun monitoring her own responses to Richard's compliments, trying to ensure she wasn't inadvertently encouraging inappropriate behavior. She'd started calculating her words more carefully, making sure her professional enthusiasm wasn't being misinterpreted as personal interest. The self-monitoring was exhausting, but Emma felt it was necessary. If Richard was testing boundaries, she needed to maintain clear professional distance. If he was genuinely being mentoring, she needed to be careful not to damage the relationship with inappropriate suspicion. The breaking point came during a client strategy session where Emma had prepared extensive market research for a new account. Richard had praised her work effusively, but his compliments had focused as much on her presentation style as her analytical insights. "Emma has this remarkable ability to make complex data compelling," he'd told the client. "She brings a certain energy to her presentations that's quite engaging." After the meeting, as the team debriefed, Richard had lingered to speak with Emma privately. "Exceptional work today," he'd said, standing closer than necessary in the empty conference room. "You really have a gift for connecting with clients. There's something about your presence that draws people in." "Thank you," Emma had replied, stepping back slightly. "I've been thinking," Richard continued, seemingly oblivious to her discomfort, "that you might benefit from some one-on-one strategic coaching. I'd like to schedule regular sessions to help develop your client management skills." The offer was exactly the kind of professional development opportunity Emma would have jumped at 6 months ago. But now, the prospect of regular private meetings with Richard felt threatening rather than exciting. "That's very generous," she'd said carefully, "but I wouldn't want to take time away from your other responsibilities." "Your professional development is a priority for me," Richard had replied, his tone carrying what felt like personal investment. "I see tremendous potential in you, Emma. The kind of potential that could take you to the top of this industry." As he'd spoken, Richard had moved closer, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone. "I'd like to take a more active role in nurturing that potential. Would you be open to that?" The question had hung in the air, loaded with implications that Emma couldn't quite define but couldn't ignore. Was Richard offering enhanced mentorship, or was he proposing something more personal? The ambiguity was maddening, leaving her unable to respond appropriately because she couldn't determine what she was responding to. "I'll think about it," she'd said finally, gathering her materials and leaving the conference room with the feeling that she'd just navigated a minefield without knowing where the explosives were buried. That evening, Emma had added the interaction to her notebook with growing certainty that her investigation was revealing something significant. The question was whether she was uncovering evidence of inappropriate behavior, or whether she was documenting the paranoid fantasies of her own increasingly unstable mind. The investigation had provided data, but no clarity. If anything, Emma felt more confused than ever about Richard's true motivations and her own perceptions of the situation. The text message arrived on a Saturday morning while Emma was grocery shopping with Jake. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced down to see Richard's name on the screen, the first time he'd ever contacted her outside of work hours. "Emma, I know it's the weekend, but I had some thoughts about the Morrison account strategy that I'd love to discuss. Would you be available for a brief call?" Richard. Emma stared at the message, her pulse quickening. Richard had never contacted her personally before, always going through official channels or stopping by her desk during work hours. The weekend text felt like a boundary violation, though she couldn't articulate exactly why. "Everything okay?" Jake asked, noticing her expression as they stood in the produce section. "Richard wants to discuss the Morrison account," Emma said, showing him the message. "On Saturday?" "That's dedication." Jake seemed pleased rather than concerned. The Morrison account is huge for the firm. If Richard's thinking about strategy over the weekend, he must really value your input. Emma wanted to share Jake's interpretation, but something about the message felt personal rather than professional. The casual tone, the weekend timing, the direct contact to her personal phone, it all contributed to her growing sense that Richard was systematically testing boundaries and escalating his personal involvement in her life. She responded professionally. "I'm happy to discuss strategy first thing Monday morning. Have a good weekend." Richard's reply came within minutes. "Of course. I hope you're enjoying your time off. You work so hard, you deserve to relax." The follow-up message sent chills down Emma's spine. It wasn't the professional acknowledgement she'd expected, but a personal comment about her work habits and well-being. The caring tone felt intimate rather than managerial, as if Richard was positioning himself as someone who worried about her personal welfare. She didn't respond to the second message, but it haunted her throughout the weekend. Every time she tried to relax, she found herself thinking about Richard's apparent concern for her personal life, his weekend intrusion into her private time, his increasing focus on her as an individual rather than just an employee. Monday morning brought a new level of intensity to Richard's behavior that Emma couldn't dismiss as imagination or misinterpretation. "Emma, perfect timing," Richard said as she arrived at the office. "I've been looking forward to our strategy discussion." She'd expected a brief conversation at her desk or in the main conference room, but Richard gestured toward his private office. "Let's talk in here where we won't be interrupted." The request wasn't unusual. Partners often held strategic discussions in their private offices. But Emma felt increasingly uncomfortable as Richard closed the door behind them and gestured for her to sit in the chair closest to his desk, rather than the more formal seating area across the room. "Coffee?" he offered, moving to the small machine in the corner of his office. "I'm fine, thank you." "You sure? You seem a little tense." "Everything all right?" The personal concern in his voice made Emma's skin crawl. Richard was asking about her emotional state with the kind of intimate attention that felt inappropriate from her boss, regardless of the mentoring relationship. "I'm fine," she repeated, trying to keep her voice professional. "You mentioned strategy thoughts about the Morrison account." "Right, yes." Richard settled into his chair, but instead of discussing business immediately, he leaned back and studied her with what felt like personal rather than professional interest. "You know, Emma, I've been thinking about our conversation last week regarding one-on-one coaching sessions. Emma's stomach dropped. She'd hoped Richard had forgotten about that proposal, or that her non-committal response had indicated her lack of interest. I really think it would benefit both of us, Richard continued. You have so much potential, and I'd love the opportunity to help you realize it fully. I appreciate the offer, Emma said carefully, but I'm not sure my schedule allows for additional meetings right now. We could make it work, Richard replied smoothly. Maybe evening sessions, when the office is quieter and we could really focus without interruptions. The suggestion of evening meetings sent alarm bells through Emma's mind. Evening sessions meant being alone in the office with Richard, away from the safety of other colleagues and normal business hours. It felt like a significant escalation from his previous boundary-testing behavior. I prefer to keep my evenings free for personal time, Emma said, trying to maintain professional courtesy while firmly declining. Richard's expression shifted slightly, a flash of something that looked like disappointment or frustration before he recovered his mentoring demeanor. Of course, work-life balance is important, he said, but his tone suggested he viewed her refusal as a missed opportunity rather than a reasonable boundary. Though I hope you'll reconsider. Sometimes the most significant professional growth happens when we're willing to invest extra time and energy. The implication felt loaded, that Emma's career advancement depended on her willingness to spend private time with Richard, that refusing his personal attention might limit her professional opportunities. I'll think about it, Emma said, using the same non-committal response that had failed to deter him before. Good. I hope you will. Richard leaned forward slightly, his attention intensely focused on her face. You know, Emma, I see so much of myself in you at your age. The ambition, the intelligence, the appeal. The pause before appeal made Emma's blood run cold. Richard was complimenting her attractiveness in a way that couldn't be interpreted as purely professional, crossing a line that made her deeply uncomfortable. I should get back to my desk, Emma said, standing abruptly. Of course. But Emma. Richard stood as well, moving closer to her than necessary. I want you to know that you can come to me with anything. Professional concerns, personal challenges, whatever you need. My door is always open for you. The offer sounded supportive, but Emma heard the subtext. Richard was positioning himself as someone who wanted involvement in her personal life, someone who saw their relationship as extending beyond normal professional boundaries. As Emma left Richard's office, she felt shaken by the escalation in his behavior. The weekend text, the closed-door meeting, the suggestion of evening sessions, the personal compliment about her appeal. It all pointed toward Richard systematically pushing boundaries and testing her responses. The rest of the week brought a series of interactions that confirmed Emma's worst fears about the direction of Richard's attention. He began finding excuses to stop by her desk multiple times each day, always with ostensibly professional reasons, but lingering to make personal conversation. He asked about her lunch plans, her weekend activities, her exercise routine. He commented on her appearance more frequently, praising her choice of colors, her hairstyle, her energy, in ways that felt uncomfortably personal. Most disturbingly, Richard began creating situations that required them to work closely together. He assigned her to projects that necessitated extended collaboration, scheduled client meetings that positioned her as his primary support, and suggested joint travel to client sites that would require overnight stays. The Peterson client wants to meet next Friday in Chicago, Richard announced during a team meeting. Emma, I'd like you to accompany me. Your research will be crucial for the presentation. Emma felt trapped. Refusing would appear unprofessional and potentially damage her career, but accepting meant spending extended time alone with Richard, including travel and potentially overnight accommodation arrangements. I'm not sure my schedule allows for travel next week, she said, grasping for an excuse. We'll make it work, Richard replied, his tone suggesting the matter was decided rather than negotiated. This client relationship is too important to compromise with scheduling concerns. After the meeting, Emma approached David, hoping to delegate or share the responsibility. "Congratulations on the Chicago trip," David said. "Richard must really trust your client management skills to include you in such an important meeting." Emma realized that her colleagues viewed Richard's attention as professional recognition rather than inappropriate behavior. To them, she was receiving valuable opportunities and mentorship. Only Emma seemed to perceive the personal undertones that made each interaction feel threatening. The Chicago trip became a source of constant anxiety. Emma found herself researching the client, the meeting agenda, the travel arrangements, looking for ways to maintain professional distance during what felt like a deliberately orchestrated opportunity for Richard to escalate his behavior. She tried discussing her concerns with Jake again, but his response was becoming predictably dismissive. "You're going to Chicago with your mentor for an important client meeting," Jake said. "This is exactly the kind of opportunity that will advance your career. Stop looking for problems where they don't exist." "But what if something happens? What if he tries to? Tries to what? Give you career advice? Discuss strategy?" "Emma, you're turning normal business travel into some kind of thriller scenario." Emma felt increasingly isolated as Richard's behavior escalated, and everyone else continued to interpret his actions as normal mentorship. The gap between her perception and others' interpretations was widening, making her question whether she was losing her grip on reality or whether she was the only one seeing Richard's true intentions. The week leading up to the Chicago trip was filled with increasingly personal interactions from Richard. He asked about her hotel preferences, suggested they have dinner together to discuss strategy, and made comments about looking forward to working closely with her in a different environment. Each interaction felt like another step toward a situation Emma desperately wanted to avoid, but couldn't figure out how to escape without destroying her career and confirming everyone's suspicions that she was paranoid and ungrateful. The escalation was undeniable now, but Emma remained trapped by the ambiguity that had characterized Richard's behavior from the beginning. Everything he did maintained plausible professional justification, leaving Emma unable to prove her concerns or take action without appearing irrational. As the Chicago trip approached, Emma felt like she was walking toward a confrontation she wasn't prepared for, with a man whose intentions remained maddeningly unclear but increasingly threatening. The flight to Chicago felt like a countdown to disaster. Emma sat in the window seat, hyper-aware of Richard's presence beside her as he reviewed client materials and made casual conversation that felt loaded with subtext. Every interaction reinforced her growing certainty that this trip was designed to create opportunities for escalated personal behavior under the guise of professional necessity. "The Riverside Hotel has an excellent restaurant," Richard mentioned as they descended toward O'Hare. "I thought we could have dinner there tonight to discuss tomorrow's presentation strategy." Emma's pulse quickened. A dinner meeting in their hotel felt like exactly the kind of situation she'd been dreading. Intimate, private, away from the safety of colleagues and normal business environments. "I was planning to review my notes and get some rest," she replied, trying to sound professional rather than panicked. "Long day tomorrow." "Of course, but I think some strategic alignment would be valuable. The Peterson account is too important to leave anything to chance." Richard's tone was reasonable, making Emma's reluctance seem unprofessional rather than prudent. She felt trapped between her instincts and her career obligations, unable to refuse without appearing uncooperative or damaging her professional reputation. The hotel check-in process amplified Emma's anxiety. Richard had arranged adjoining rooms, ostensibly for convenience during their preparation work, but the proximity felt threatening rather than practical. As the desk clerk handed over their key cards, Richard's fingers brushed Emma's in a way that felt deliberate. "I'll give you an hour to settle in," he said. "Then we can meet in the bar to discuss our approach." Emma nodded, but as she entered her room, she felt like she was preparing for battle rather than a business dinner. She changed into the most conservative outfit she'd packed, a dark blazer and high-necked blouse that covered as much skin as possible, and mentally rehearsed strategies for maintaining professional distance during what felt like an increasingly personal dynamic. The hotel bar was dimly lit and intimate, filled with low conversations and soft jazz music that created an atmosphere more suited to romantic dinners than business meetings. Richard had already secured a corner table, positioning himself so that Emma would have to sit close beside him rather than across from him. "Perfect timing," he said, standing as she approached. "I took the liberty of ordering wine. I hope you don't mind. I thought we should celebrate our successful partnership." The word partnership felt loaded with meaning beyond their professional collaboration. Emma accepted the wine glass but barely touched it, hyper-aware that alcohol would compromise her ability to navigate whatever situation was developing. "So," Richard began, leaning closer under the pretense of reviewing documents, "I've been thinking about your presentation tomorrow. You have such a natural charisma when you're speaking. It's quite captivating." The compliment made Emma's skin crawl. Richard was focusing on her physical presence rather than her analytical skills, framing her professional abilities in terms that felt personal and sexual. "I think the data speaks for itself," Emma replied, trying to redirect the conversation toward actual business content. "Data is important, but presentation is everything," Richard continued, his hand moving to rest on the table close enough to hers that their fingers nearly touched. "The way you command attention when you're speaking, the confidence you project, it's quite remarkable." Emma pulled her hand back, ostensibly to reach for her water glass. "I think preparation is the key to effective presentations." "Preparation, yes, but also natural talent." Richard's eyes lingered on her face in a way that felt invasive. "You have qualities that can't be taught, Emma. Qualities that could take you very far in this industry, with the right guidance." The implication was clear. Richard was positioning himself as the right guidance, suggesting that Emma's career advancement depended on maintaining his personal interest and approval. "I appreciate your mentorship," Emma said carefully, "but I think my success depends primarily on my analytical skills and work quality." "Of course, but never underestimate the importance of relationships in this business." Richard moved his chair closer, reducing the physical distance between them. "Trust, connection, mutual understanding. These things matter as much as technical competence." Emma felt increasingly cornered as Richard's language became more personal and his physical proximity more invasive. She realized that this dinner was the confrontation she'd been dreading, the moment when Richard's gradual boundary testing would escalate into something more explicitly inappropriate. "Richard," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "I want to make sure we maintain appropriate professional boundaries." The statement hung in the air between them, a direct challenge to Richard's behavior that could no longer be dismissed as misunderstanding or misinterpretation. Richard's expression shifted, surprise flickering across his features before settling into something that looked like disappointed patience. "I'm not sure what you mean," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "I've been nothing but supportive of your career development." "I know, and I appreciate that," Emma replied, realizing she was walking into the minefield she'd been trying to avoid. "But some of your comments and attention feel more personal than professional." "Personal?" Richard's eyebrows raised, his expression suggesting that Emma was making unreasonable accusations. "Emma, I think you may be misinterpreting my investment in your professional growth." The response was perfectly crafted. Richard was denying inappropriate behavior while simultaneously suggesting that Emma was unstable or paranoid for perceiving it. She found herself in the impossible position of having to prove that his behavior was inappropriate when everything he'd done maintained plausible professional justification. "Maybe I am misinterpreting," Emma said, backing down slightly, "but I'd prefer to keep our interactions focused on work deliverables." "Of course," Richard replied smoothly, but his tone carried an undertone of disappointment that felt like a threat. "Though I hope this doesn't mean you're not interested in the enhanced mentorship opportunities I've discussed." The implication was clear. If Emma didn't accept Richard's personal attention, she might lose access to the professional opportunities he controlled. It was a subtle form of coercion that left her feeling trapped between her career ambitions and her personal safety. "I think our current working relationship is appropriate," Emma said, trying to sound diplomatic rather than confrontational. Richard nodded, but his demeanor had shifted noticeably. The warm, interested mentor had been replaced by someone who seemed calculating and slightly cold. "I understand," he said, signaling for the check. "Perhaps we should call it an early evening. Big day tomorrow." As they returned to their rooms, Emma felt like she'd won a battle, but potentially lost the war. She'd successfully confronted Richard's inappropriate behavior, but his response suggested that there would be professional consequences for her refusal to accept his personal attention. The next morning's client presentation went smoothly from a business perspective, but Emma could feel the shift in Richard's behavior toward her. He was professional but distant, crediting her work without enthusiasm, including her in discussions without the warm approval she'd become accustomed to. During breaks, Richard's attention seemed to focus more on David and the other male colleagues, as if Emma had been relegated to a less favored status within the team. The change was subtle but unmistakable. Richard was demonstrating what happened when someone rejected his personal interest. The flight home was awkward, with Richard maintaining polite but cool professionalism that felt like punishment. Emma realized that her confrontation had succeeded in stopping his inappropriate behavior, but at the cost of the mentorship and opportunities that had been advancing her career. Over the following weeks, the consequences of Emma's boundary setting became increasingly apparent. Richard no longer stopped by her desk for casual conversations. He didn't include her in high-level strategy discussions. The plum assignments and client presentations that had been flowing her way dried up, redirected to colleagues who hadn't challenged Richard's authority. Most frustratingly, Richard's behavior was now unimpeachably professional. He treated Emma with the same distant courtesy he showed all junior associates, making it impossible for her to complain about retaliation without sounding paranoid or ungrateful. "You got what you wanted," Jake said when Emma tried to explain the shift in Richard's behavior. "He's keeping things strictly professional now. Isn't that what you were asking for?" Emma couldn't explain that Richard's current behavior felt like punishment rather than appropriate professionalism, that the sudden absence of opportunities felt deliberately retaliatory. To everyone else, Richard was simply treating Emma like any other employee, which was exactly what she'd claimed to want. But Emma knew the difference between normal professional interaction and the deliberate withdrawal of favor. Richard was demonstrating his power over her career trajectory, showing her what happened when someone rejected his personal attention. The confrontation had solved the immediate problem of inappropriate behavior, but created new problems around professional retaliation and career advancement. Emma found herself wondering if she'd made the right choice, if standing up for her boundaries was worth the cost to her professional future. Worse, she realized that Richard's response proved her instincts had been correct all along. A genuine mentor wouldn't have withdrawn professional support simply because a mentee requested appropriate boundaries. Richard's retaliation confirmed that his previous attention had indeed been inappropriate, that her concerns hadn't been paranoid fantasies. But this validation came at a significant cost. Emma had successfully confronted Richard's behavior, but the victory felt hollow when it resulted in professional isolation and career stagnation. As she sat at her desk, reviewing assignments that were significantly less challenging than the work she'd been doing months earlier, Emma realized that confronting inappropriate behavior in the workplace was more complex than simply standing up for herself. Power dynamics, professional relationships, and career advancement all complicated the ability to address problematic behavior without facing consequences. The confrontation had revealed the truth about Richard's motivations, but left Emma in a worse professional position than before. She'd won the battle for appropriate boundaries, but lost the war for career advancement and professional respect. The question now was whether the cost of her integrity was worth the price she was paying, and whether there were any other options for addressing the retaliation she was experiencing without further damaging her professional future. 3 weeks after Chicago, Emma's professional life had become a carefully orchestrated form of psychological warfare. Richard Morrison continued to maintain perfect professional courtesy while systematically dismantling every opportunity that had previously made her career flourish. The subtle retaliation was driving her toward a breaking point she hadn't seen coming. Emma found herself arriving at the office earlier each morning, staying later each evening, desperately trying to prove her value through sheer effort and determination. But the harder she worked, the more invisible she seemed to become. Projects that would have naturally fallen to her were reassigned to David or Marcus. Client presentations she developed were delivered by colleagues who received credit for her research. Strategic meetings happened without her knowledge, leaving her to discover important decisions through casual hallway conversations. The psychological toll was devastating. Emma had gone from being Richard's rising star to feeling like a ghost haunting her own workplace. The transition was so gradual, so professionally executed, that she couldn't prove retaliation without sounding paranoid. Exactly the reputation she'd been trying to avoid. Maybe this is just normal workplace dynamics, Jake suggested over dinner, his patience for Emma's concerns clearly exhausted. You can't expect to be Richard's favorite forever. Other people deserve opportunities too. It's not about being anyone's favorite, Emma replied, her voice carrying an edge of desperation that surprised them both. It's about professional retaliation for setting boundaries with someone who is behaving inappropriately. You don't know that, Jake said firmly. You're assuming malicious intent when the explanation could be much simpler. Maybe Richard backed off because he realized you were uncomfortable, and now he's giving you space. The conversation felt like gaslighting, even though Emma knew Jake wasn't intentionally trying to undermine her perceptions. The gap between her reality and everyone else's interpretation had become so wide that she felt like she was living in a parallel universe where her experiences didn't count as evidence. Emma had started documenting the professional retaliation with the same obsessive attention she'd previously applied to Richard's inappropriate behavior. The pattern was undeniable to her, but invisible to everyone else. March 28th. Henderson follow-up project assigned to David despite my leading the original campaign. Richard cited workload distribution as reasoning. April 2nd. Excluded from Morrison Industries strategy meeting. Discovered client requested my specific input, but Richard said I was too busy with other priorities. April 5th. Peterson account presentation reassigned to Marcus 2 days before client meeting. Richard said he wanted fresh perspective despite my months of relationship building. The documentation was therapeutic, but ultimately useless. Emma couldn't file a complaint about being excluded from meetings or having projects reassigned without concrete evidence of discriminatory motivation. Richard's explanations were always reasonable, his decisions always defensible from a business perspective. The breaking point began with an overheard conversation that shattered Emma's remaining faith in her professional relationships. She'd been working late on a quarterly report, one of the few substantial assignments she still received, when she heard voices from Richard's office. The door was slightly ajar, and Emma recognized David's voice discussing the upcoming Peterson client renewal. The relationship has really flourished under your guidance, David was saying. Emma did good foundational work, but I think the client responds better to a more senior presence. Emma is talented, Richard replied, his voice carrying the dismissive tone he now used when discussing her work. But she seems to have lost some of her initial enthusiasm. I'm not sure she's as committed to client development as she initially appeared. Emma felt the words like physical blows. Richard was systematically rewriting the narrative of her professional decline, suggesting that her reduced visibility was due to her own lack of commitment rather than his deliberate exclusion. It's unfortunate, Richard continued, when promising junior associates don't live up to their potential. But we have to make decisions based on current performance, not past promise. David murmured agreement, and Emma realized that her colleagues were accepting Richard's characterization of her professional decline without question. To them, she wasn't being retaliated against. She was simply failing to maintain the high standards that had initially attracted Richard's attention. The conversation revealed the sophistication of Richard's retaliation strategy. He wasn't just punishing Emma by withdrawing opportunities. He was actively managing her professional reputation, ensuring that her career decline appeared to be self-inflicted rather than imposed. Emma retreated to her desk, shaking with anger and frustration. She'd suspected that Richard was retaliating against her, but hadn't realized the extent to which he was poisoning her professional relationships and undermining her reputation with colleagues. The next morning brought the final blow that pushed Emma past her psychological breaking point. "Emma, could I see you in my office?" Richard's tone was businesslike, giving no indication of the career-altering conversation that was about to occur. Emma followed him into the familiar space where so many uncomfortable interactions had occurred, but this time Richard's demeanor was coolly professional rather than inappropriately personal. "I've been reviewing your recent performance," Richard began, settling behind his desk with the air of someone delivering routine feedback. "And I'm concerned about what appears to be a decline in your engagement and productivity." Emma felt her chest tighten. Richard was weaponizing performance review language to formalize the retaliation he'd been implementing informally for weeks. "I haven't noticed any decline in my work quality," Emma replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Quality isn't the issue," Richard said smoothly. "It's about initiative, leadership potential, the kind of strategic thinking that distinguishes exceptional employees from merely competent ones." The irony was devastating. Richard was criticizing Emma for lacking the very qualities he'd previously praised, the initiative and strategic thinking that had made her his rising star before she'd rejected his inappropriate advances. "I think there may be some misunderstanding about my commitment level," Emma said, realizing she was about to fight for her professional life. "I don't think there's any misunderstanding," Richard replied, his tone suggesting the matter was already decided. "I've observed a pattern of reduced engagement, missed opportunities for leadership, and what frankly appears to be a lack of enthusiasm for the collaborative relationships that drive success in this industry." Emma recognized the language he was using. Collaborative relationships was code for the personal dynamic she'd rejected in Chicago. Richard was essentially telling her that refusing his inappropriate attention had marked her as uncooperative and unpromotable. "Richard," Emma said, her voice beginning to shake with anger she could no longer suppress, "we both know this isn't about my performance. This is about what happened in Chicago, about my setting professional boundaries that you didn't want to respect." The accusation hung in the air between them, the most direct confrontation Emma had ever attempted. She was abandoning all pretense of diplomatic language, finally calling Richard's behavior what it was. Richard's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "I'm not sure what you're implying, Emma, but I'd be very careful about making accusations that could be interpreted as defamatory." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Richard was warning Emma that challenging his version of events could result in legal consequences or further professional retaliation. "I'm not making accusations," Emma replied, though they both knew she absolutely was. "I'm trying to understand why my professional standing has changed so dramatically since I requested appropriate boundaries in our working relationship." "Your professional standing has changed because your performance has declined," Richard said firmly. "I understand that feedback can be difficult to hear, but effective employees learn from constructive criticism rather than looking for external explanations for their shortcomings." The gaslighting was masterful. Richard was not only denying that retaliation had occurred, but suggesting that Emma's perception of retaliation was evidence of her inability to accept responsibility for her own professional failures. Emma realized she was trapped in an impossible situation. She could continue fighting Richard's characterization of her performance, but doing so would only reinforce his narrative that she was defensive and unable to accept feedback. She could escalate to HR, but without concrete evidence of discrimination, her complaints would likely be dismissed as the grievances of an underperforming employee. "I think we should end this conversation," Emma said, standing abruptly before she said something that would definitely destroy her career. "Emma," Richard called as she reached the door, "I hope you'll think carefully about your next steps." Your career trajectory depends on making smart choices about how you handle professional challenges. The warning was crystal clear. Richard was telling Emma that any attempt to challenge his authority or report his behavior would result in the complete destruction of her professional future. As Emma returned to her desk, she felt something fundamental break inside her. The careful composure she'd maintained throughout months of inappropriate behavior and weeks of retaliation finally shattered. She was trapped in a system where speaking up about harassment led to career destruction, where setting boundaries resulted in professional punishment, where the victim became responsible for managing the consequences of the perpetrator's behavior. The breaking point had arrived, but Emma realized that reaching it didn't provide clarity or resolution. Instead, it revealed the full scope of her powerlessness and the sophistication of the system designed to silence her. Sitting at her desk, surrounded by assignments that no longer challenged her and colleagues who no longer respected her, Emma understood that she faced an impossible choice. Accept professional marginalization as the price of maintaining her integrity, or find a way to fight back against a system designed to make resistance impossible. The breaking point wasn't the moment of clarity she'd expected. It was the moment she realized that all her options led to different forms of destruction, and that the only question remaining was which type of destruction she could live with. Emma sat in her car in the Morrison & Associates parking garage at 11:47 p.m., staring at the building where her career was slowly dying. She'd been there for over an hour, trying to summon the courage for what felt like either the most important decision of her professional life or the final confirmation of her complete psychological breakdown. The USB drive in her hand contained everything: months of documented interactions, performance reviews, project reassignments, meeting exclusions, and the audio recording she'd made during that morning's devastating conversation with Richard. She'd started recording their interactions 3 weeks ago, using her phone's voice memo app hidden in her blazer pocket, desperate to capture evidence of the retaliation that everyone else refused to acknowledge. The recording was damning, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that it might also damn her. Richard's carefully crafted language maintained plausible deniability, even as he systematically destroyed her professional standing. To an outside observer, the conversation might sound like legitimate performance feedback rather than sophisticated retaliation. Emma's phone buzzed with a text from Jake. "Where are you? It's almost midnight." She couldn't explain where she was or what she was contemplating. Jake had made his position clear during their argument that evening. Emma needed to stop obsessing over conspiracy theories and focus on rebuilding her professional reputation through hard work and positive attitude. The suggestion that her career decline was self-inflicted had finally pushed Emma past the point of trying to convince anyone else of her reality. The building security guard made his rounds, his flashlight briefly illuminating Emma's car before moving on. She knew the guard's schedule now, had been observing it for weeks as part of her desperate attempt to understand the full scope of Richard's behavior. What she'd discovered in those late-night surveillance sessions had either validated her worst fears or confirmed her complete descent into paranoid delusion. Richard Morrison stayed late far more frequently than anyone realized, often remaining in the building until well past midnight. Emma had documented 17 occasions when Richard's car was the last one in the executive parking area, and she'd started to wonder what kind of work required such extensive evening hours. Tonight, she was going to find out. Emma had discovered that the building's keycard access logs were stored on a shared server that she could access with her employee credentials. What she'd found in those logs had shaken her to her core, or driven her completely over the edge into conspiracy-minded madness. Richard had been accessing the building at unusual hours for months, including weekends and holidays when no business meetings or client work would justify his presence. More disturbing, he'd been using his executive access to enter areas of the building where he had no apparent professional reason to be, including the human resources offices where personnel files were stored. Emma had cross-referenced Richard's unusual building access with her own work schedule and discovered a pattern that made her blood run cold. Richard's late-night visits to the office coincided almost perfectly with evenings when Emma had stayed late to work on projects. He'd been monitoring her schedule, timing his building access to coincide with her presence in the office. The implications were terrifying. Either Richard had been stalking her schedule for months, using his executive access to create opportunities for private interactions, or Emma had become so paranoid that she was finding sinister patterns in completely innocent data. Tonight's discovery had pushed her past the point of uncertainty into the realm of either absolute clarity or complete delusion. Emma had accessed Richard's computer remotely using the shared network credentials that all employees used for collaborative projects. What she'd found in his browser history and saved files had either revealed the true scope of his inappropriate behavior or confirmed that she'd crossed the line into criminal invasion of privacy driven by paranoid fantasies. Richard's computer contained extensive research into Emma's background, her social media profiles, her professional history, her educational records, even public records about her family and personal relationships. He'd compiled what amounted to a detailed personal dossier that went far beyond anything related to her employment at the firm. More disturbing were the saved images, screenshots of Emma's social media photos, pictures from company events that focused specifically on her, even what appeared to be covertly taken photos from office meetings where Emma was unaware she was being photographed. The collection suggested either obsessive surveillance or the kind of systematic documentation that Emma herself had been conducting to prove Richard's inappropriate behavior. The most damning evidence was a series of documents that appeared to outline a deliberate strategy for managing Emma's career trajectory. Richard had created detailed files tracking her performance, her responses to his mentorship, her interactions with other colleagues, and what looked like contingency plans for different scenarios, including resistance to enhanced mentoring relationship and escalation to HR concerns. The documents either proved that Richard had been systematically manipulating Emma's career from the beginning, or they were evidence that Emma had fabricated elaborate digital evidence to support her increasingly paranoid delusions about her boss's motivations. Emma stared at the USB drive containing all her evidence, uncertain whether it would vindicate her months of growing concern or provide proof of her complete psychological breakdown. The line between investigation and obsession had become so blurred that she could no longer distinguish between uncovering the truth and creating elaborate conspiracies to explain her professional failures. At 12:15 a.m., Richard's Mercedes pulled into the executive parking area. Emma's heart raced as she watched Richard enter the building alone, just as her surveillance had predicted. This was the moment that would either confirm her worst fears or prove that she'd become the paranoid, unstable woman that everyone already suspected she was. She waited 15 minutes before using her key card to enter the building, her hands shaking as she navigated the familiar hallways that felt alien and threatening in the darkness. The security cameras tracked her movement, creating a digital record of what might be either the most important investigation of her life or the final evidence of her criminal harassment of an innocent colleague. Emma made her way to the executive floor, guided by the building layout she'd memorized during her months of working there. Richard's office light was on, and she could see his silhouette through the frosted glass, hunched over his computer in what appeared to be intense concentration. She approached quietly, her phone recording everything, though she wasn't sure whether the evidence would support her version of events or provide proof of her illegal stalking behavior. As she drew closer to Richard's office, Emma could see his computer screen reflected in the darkened windows. What she saw either validated every suspicion she'd harbored or confirmed that her paranoid delusions had driven her to misinterpret innocent professional activities as evidence of criminal behavior. Richard was reviewing personnel files, not just Emma's, but files for several female employees, including photographs, performance reviews, and what appeared to be personal notes about their appearances, their relationship status, their career ambitions. The screen showed detailed assessments of their responses to his mentorship, their potential for enhanced professional relationships, and strategic plans for managing their career development. Emma was either witnessing proof of a systematic pattern of inappropriate behavior toward multiple female employees, or she was misinterpreting legitimate HR activities through the lens of her own paranoid obsessions. Richard's phone rang, startling both of them. As he answered, Emma caught fragments of a conversation that either confirmed her worst fears or provided meaningless evidence that she would misinterpret to support her delusions. "The Peterson situation requires careful management," Richard was saying. "She's more resistant than anticipated, but the career pressure should encourage cooperation." Yes, the Chicago approach was effective for clarifying boundaries. "No, I don't think escalation to formal disciplinary action will be necessary if we maintain consistent pressure." Emma's blood ran cold. Richard was discussing her situation as if it were a calculated campaign of professional manipulation, describing his retaliation as career pressure designed to encourage her cooperation with his inappropriate advances. Or she was overhearing a completely innocent business conversation and projecting her own paranoid interpretations onto routine professional discussions about employee management. Emma backed away from Richard's office, her hands shaking as she tried to process what she'd witnessed. The evidence she'd gathered painted a picture of systematic harassment, professional retaliation, and predatory behavior that extended far beyond her own experiences. Richard Morrison appeared to be a sophisticated manipulator who used his professional authority to exploit female employees, carefully documenting their responses and strategically managing their careers to maintain control over them. Or Emma Martinez was a paranoid, unstable woman who had broken into her boss's office in the middle of the night to spy on routine business activities, interpreting innocent professional behavior as evidence of criminal conspiracy because she couldn't accept responsibility for her own declining job performance. As Emma left the building, USB drive clutched in her trembling hand, she realized that she possessed either the evidence that would expose Richard Morrison's predatory behavior and save other women from experiencing what she'd endured, or the proof of her own criminal harassment of an innocent man who had tried to mentor her career. The truth existed somewhere in the ambiguous space between her perceptions and everyone else's reality, in the gap between evidence and interpretation, between justified suspicion and paranoid delusion. Emma sat in her car, staring at the USB drive that contained either her vindication or her destruction, knowing that whatever she did next would determine not just her professional future, but her fundamental understanding of her own relationship with reality. The climactic revelation had arrived, but instead of clarity, it brought only the terrible certainty that the truth might be forever unknowable, trapped in the psychological space where perception, evidence, and reality intersected in ways that could never be definitively resolved. Emma stared at her laptop screen at 3:47 a.m., the cursor blinking in the empty email composition window like a heartbeat counting down to an irreversible decision. The recipient field contained 3 email addresses: the Morrison and Associates HR Director, the State Labor Relations Board, and a journalist who specialized in workplace harassment investigations. The USB drive sat beside her laptop, containing either the evidence that would expose Richard Morrison as a predatory manipulator or the digital proof of her own descent into criminal stalking behavior. After 6 hours of reviewing the files, analyzing the patterns, and questioning her own perceptions, Emma was no closer to certainty than she'd been when she first suspected Richard's inappropriate behavior months ago. The evidence was simultaneously damning and inconclusive. Richard's extensive research into her background could be interpreted as either obsessive surveillance or thorough professional due diligence. His strategic documentation of her responses could be evidence of calculated manipulation or legitimate employee management. His late-night building access could represent stalking behavior or simply the demanding schedule of a dedicated partner. Every piece of evidence existed in the ambiguous space between innocent explanation and sinister motivation, leaving Emma trapped in the same psychological limbo that had characterized their entire relationship. Jake stirred in the bedroom, and Emma quickly minimized her email window. She'd been sitting at their kitchen table since returning from her midnight reconnaissance mission, wrestling with a decision that would determine not just her professional future, but her fundamental relationship with reality. If she sent the emails, she would either expose a predator and potentially save other women from harassment, or destroy an innocent man's reputation while confirming her own status as an unstable employee who couldn't distinguish between mentorship and manipulation. If she didn't send the emails, she would either allow Richard to continue his systematic abuse of female employees, or she would be making the rational decision to stop pursuing vindication for imaginary grievances against a boss who had tried to help her career. The uncertainty was maddening, but Emma realized that ambiguity itself might be the point. Richard's behavior had been carefully calibrated to exist in the gray area where inappropriate actions could be explained away as professional interest, where retaliation could be disguised as performance management, where the victim's perceptions could be dismissed as paranoid delusions. Whether by design or coincidence, Richard had created a situation where Emma could never definitively prove her accusations, leaving her trapped in a prison of uncertainty where she questioned her own sanity rather than challenging his authority. At 6:30 a.m., Emma made her decision. She sent the email to HR, not because she was certain of Richard's guilt, but because the uncertainty itself had become unbearable. Emma attached the evidence she'd gathered, knowing it would be interpreted based on the reviewer's pre-existing assumptions about her credibility and Richard's character. The investigation would either vindicate her concerns or confirm everyone's suspicions about her mental stability. The response came faster than Emma expected. By 10 a.m., she received a call from Janet Morrison, the HR director and Richard's sister-in-law, requesting an immediate meeting to discuss her concerns about workplace dynamics. Emma should have researched the family connections within Morrison and Associates more thoroughly. Janet Morrison had been evaluating sexual harassment complaints against her husband's business partner, a conflict of interest that either guaranteed the suppression of Emma's allegations or provided another layer of conspiracy thinking that proved her paranoid mindset. The HR meeting was a masterclass in institutional gaslighting, though Emma couldn't determine whether she was experiencing deliberate manipulation or receiving legitimate feedback about her problematic behavior. "I've reviewed your documentation," Janet said, the pause before documentation suggesting that Emma's evidence was being categorized as something less credible than actual proof. "And I'm concerned about both the nature of your allegations and the methods you used to gather this information." Emma felt her stomach drop. Instead of investigating Richard's behavior, HR was questioning her surveillance activities, her after-hours building access, her remote access to Richard's computer systems. "I was trying to document patterns of inappropriate behavior," Emma explained, already sensing that her justifications would be interpreted as evidence of her instability rather than her diligence. "Emma, what you've documented is your own concerning behavior," Janet replied, her tone suggesting that the conversation was about Emma's problems rather than Richard's actions. "Monitoring a colleague's schedule, accessing computer systems without authorization, conducting surveillance in the workplace. These are serious violations of company policy and potentially criminal behavior." The reversal was complete. Emma's investigation into Richard's harassment had been reframed as her harassment of Richard, her evidence gathering characterized as stalking, her documentation portrayed as obsessive behavior that demonstrated her unfitness for continued employment. "What about the files on Richard's computer?" Emma asked desperately. "The research into my background, the strategic planning documents, the pattern of retaliation?" "You accessed those files illegally," Janet pointed out. "Any information obtained through unauthorized computer access cannot be considered credible evidence. Moreover, your interpretation of routine business documents as evidence of harassment suggests a fundamental misunderstanding of professional relationships." Emma realized she was trapped in a system designed to protect the institution rather than investigate misconduct. Her evidence was being dismissed on procedural grounds while her methods were being characterized as proof of her unsuitability for employment. I think it would be best for everyone if you took some time to consider your career priorities, Janet continued. Perhaps a different work environment would be more suitable for your particular needs. The suggestion was clear. Resign voluntarily or face termination for misconduct. Emma's attempt to expose Richard's harassment had resulted in her own professional destruction, confirming the very retaliation she'd been trying to document. Emma left the HR meeting understanding that she faced an impossible choice between accepting professional exile or continuing to fight a system designed to silence her voice and protect Richard's reputation. 3 months later, Emma worked as a freelance marketing consultant from her apartment, her career at Morrison & Associates having ended with a mutual separation agreement that included a non-disclosure clause preventing her from discussing her experiences with Richard Morrison or the firm. The agreement provided a modest severance package in exchange for Emma's silence, a transaction that could be interpreted as either a payment to suppress legitimate harassment allegations or compensation for a troubled employee who had made false accusations against respected leadership. Emma never learned whether other women at Morrison & Associates had similar experiences with Richard, whether her allegations prompted any investigation into his behavior, or whether her concerns had been dismissed as the paranoid fantasies of an unstable employee. The non-disclosure agreement ensured that Emma's story would remain trapped in the ambiguous space where it had always existed, between truth and delusion, between justified suspicion and paranoid obsession, between evidence and interpretation. Jake moved out 6 weeks after Emma's resignation, explaining that he couldn't continue a relationship with someone who had destroyed her own career through conspiracy thinking and refused to take responsibility for her professional failures. Whether Jake was abandoning a woman who had been systematically harassed and then silenced by institutional power structures, or whether he was making the rational decision to distance himself from a partner whose paranoid delusions had led her to criminal behavior against his boss, remained a question that would never be definitively answered. Emma sat in her apartment, working on marketing campaigns for small businesses, wondering whether she had been a victim of sophisticated workplace harassment or whether she had become the paranoid woman that everyone believed her to be. The uncertainty followed her into every new professional relationship, every interaction with male colleagues, every moment when she had to decide whether to trust her instincts or dismiss them as evidence of her ongoing psychological instability. Some days, Emma believed she had uncovered the truth about Richard Morrison's predatory behavior and been silenced by institutional power that protected perpetrators at the expense of victims. Other days, she wondered whether she had invented elaborate conspiracies to explain her own professional inadequacies, becoming exactly the kind of unstable employee who made false accusations against innocent mentors. The ambiguity was permanent, a psychological prison where Emma would forever question whether her perceptions could be trusted, whether her experiences had been real, whether she was a victim or a perpetrator of the dynamics that had destroyed her career. Richard Morrison continued to lead Morrison & Associates to record profits, his reputation intact, his behavior unexamined, his methods either vindicated by Emma's departure or protected by systems designed to silence inconvenient allegations. The truth existed somewhere in the space between Emma's perceptions and everyone else's reality, between evidence and interpretation, between justified suspicion and paranoid delusion. It would remain forever unknowable, trapped in the ambiguous territory where harassment and mentorship, retaliation and performance management, victim and perpetrator existed in relationships too complex for definitive resolution. Emma's story ended not with clarity, but with the terrible understanding that some truths are designed to be unknowable, some experiences exist beyond the reach of evidence, and some victims are transformed into perpetrators simply by seeking validation for their reality. The question of whether she had been overreacting or whether her boyfriend's boss had been hitting on her would haunt Emma forever, unanswered and unanswerable, a psychological wound that would never heal because it could never be definitively understood. In the end, the ambiguity itself was the answer, a truth too uncomfortable for anyone to acknowledge, Too complex for anyone to solve, too dangerous for anyone to fully investigate. What do you think really happened here? Was Emma right all along, or did she spiral into paranoia? Drop your theory below.